I was lying flat on that hospital gurney, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the water stains to keep myself calm, when I heard my cardiologist say something that turned my blood to ice. "Make sure his wife gets this before he's out of recovery, and don't let him see what's inside." I had been awake for maybe 40 seconds. Nobody in that room knew it. The anesthesia from my cardiac catheterization was supposed to keep me under for another hour minimum. That's what they told my wife. That's what she must have been counting on. But something pulled me back early. Some stubborn refusal in my body to stay down. And I surfaced into a dim recovery bay with a thin curtain on one side and two voices I recognized on the other. My cardiologist, Dr. Whitfield, 50-something, silver hair, the kind of man who wore his confidence like a second skin. He'd been my doctor for 11 years, and a woman's voice, soft, familiar in a way that made my stomach clench before my brain caught up with why. I kept my eyes closed. I kept my breathing slow and even. I had worked construction for 31 years, and I had learned early that sometimes the smartest thing a man can do is let the other person think they're alone. "She's been waiting since 7 this morning," the woman's voice said. "She'll get it," Whitfield said. "Just make sure he doesn't see the envelope first. We've been careful this long." Then footsteps. The curtain shifted. Silence. I lay there with my heart monitor beeping steadily. 62 beats per minute, the machine said, and I thought, careful this long. That phrase, those 3 words, they didn't feel like they belonged in a hospital. My name is Leonard. I'm 64 years old, retired, living in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I am not a man who cries easily. I built things with my hands my whole working life. I coached Little League for 8 years. I drove my mother to chemotherapy every Tuesday for 14 months without missing a single appointment. I am not by nature a man who falls apart, but lying on that gurney with tubes in my arm and the smell of antiseptic in the air, I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. Let me back up. 6 weeks earlier, I had started getting dizzy during my morning walks. Not the kind of dizzy where you need a glass of water. The kind where the sidewalk seems to tilt 30 degrees and you have to grab a fence post to keep from going down. My wife, I'll call her my wife, because that's what she was for 31 years, insisted I see Dr. Whitfield immediately. She drove me to the appointment herself. She sat in the waiting room with a paperback she didn't read, while Whitfield hooked me up to an EKG and told me he wanted to do a cardiac catheterization to check for blockages. "Nothing to be alarmed about yet," he said, which is exactly what doctors say when they are, in fact, a little alarmed. My wife squeezed my hand in the parking lot. She said, "Whatever it is, we'll handle it together." She had brown eyes that had always made me feel like everything was going to be okay, and I believed her. I had believed her in one way or another for 3 decades. That was 6 weeks before I woke up on the gurney. I need to tell you a few things about our marriage so that what comes next makes sense. We had married young. I was 29, she was 27. We had 2 sons. The older one, Patrick, lived in Charlotte with his family. The younger one, Neil, had moved to Portland 3 years ago for work. Good boys, both of them. Called on Sundays, showed up for Thanksgiving. I was proud of them the way a man gets proud of something he poured himself into. The marriage had not been perfect. I don't think I've ever believed in perfect. But it had been real. We had built a house together. Not metaphorically, literally. I had swung a hammer and laid subflooring. And we had weathered job losses and a miscarriage and a stretch in the mid-90s when money was so tight we were eating rice and beans 4 nights a week. We had come out the other side of all of it, or I thought we had. About 2 years before the catheterization, something shifted. I couldn't name it exactly. She started spending more time away from the house. Yoga classes, she said, then a book club, then volunteer work at a literacy center. I didn't question it. I'm not a jealous man by nature, and I had always believed that 2 people in a marriage needed space to be separate people. I was proud of her for having things that were hers. I noticed, though, that her phone screen was always face down on the counter. I noticed she'd started deleting her text at night before she came to bed. I filed those things away in a part of my brain I didn't like to visit. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. I signed myself out of that recovery bay 40 minutes after I woke up. I told the nurse I felt fine, and I did, physically steadier than I'd expected, and I asked her to let my wife know I was ready. I did not ask about any envelope. I did not let a single thing show on my face. My wife came in looking relieved. She said, "You scared me?" She hugged me carefully, the way you hug someone you're afraid of breaking. I hugged her back with both arms and said nothing. In the car, I watched her from the corner of my eye. She seemed fine, normal. She asked whether I was hungry and whether I wanted to stop at the Cracker Barrel on the way home because they had that chicken soup I liked. I said yes. She drove with both hands on the wheel, listening to the same country station she'd listened to for 20 years. The envelope was in her purse. I could see the edge of it, Manila, tucked against the inside lining. She hadn't looked at it yet. Or if she had, she'd put it back. We sat across from each other at a laminate table, and I ate chicken soup, and she had a Cobb salad, and we talked about Patrick's youngest starting kindergarten in the fall, and I thought about those 3 words. Careful this long. I want to say the next part was instinct. Honestly. Some of it was desperation. That evening, after she went to sleep, I went to the kitchen table, where she'd left her purse, and I sat with it in front of me for probably 10 minutes. I'm not a man who goes through his wife's things. I had never in 31 years looked at her journal or read her letters or checked her phone. I had always believed that privacy was something you gave the person you loved. I opened the purse. The envelope had no return address. On the front, in handwriting I recognized as Whitfield's, I'd seen his signature on enough medical forms over the years. It said only, "For when the time is right." Inside were 2 things. The first was a printed photograph. My wife and Whitfield standing together on what looked like a boat dock. She was leaning into him. He had his arm around her shoulders in a way that was not how you stand with your cardiologist. The second was a folded letter, 2 pages. I'm not going to quote it because some things a man doesn't repeat, but the substance of it was this. Whitfield had been in love with my wife for 4 years. He laid it out plainly in the careful handwriting of a methodical man. He wrote about specific trips they had taken. A long weekend in Asheville, a weekend destined that she had told me was a girls' trip with her college friends. He wrote about conversations they'd had about the future, their future. He wrote that he was ready to stop waiting. 4 years. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning and I did the math on 4 years. I thought about every dinner we'd eaten together during those 4 years, every holiday. Every Sunday phone call with the boys where she'd sat beside me on the couch and laughed and asked Neil about his girlfriend and Patrick about his garden. 4 years of that. I put the letter and the photograph back in the envelope. I put the envelope back in her purse exactly as I'd found it. And I went to bed and lay beside my wife of 31 years, and I stared at the ceiling until the light changed. I didn't sleep. Here is what I knew about my financial situation. I thought I knew all of it. I had been wrong about that. I had handled our money for most of our marriage, the investments, the retirement accounts, the mortgage, and in the last few years when I was transitioning into retirement, I had started letting my wife manage more of the day-to-day. She was organized in ways I wasn't. She was good with spreadsheets. I trusted her. I want to be honest about that. I trusted her and I handed her the keys and I stopped looking. The week after I found the envelope, I called our financial advisor, a man named George Petty, who had handled our accounts for 12 years. I told him I wanted to go over everything, all of it, top to bottom, because my health situation had made me want to get our affairs in order. He said, of course, and we met at his office on a Thursday afternoon. It took about 45 minutes to understand what had happened. Over the course of 2 years, my wife had been making regular transfers from our joint savings account into an account I had not known existed. Not huge amounts at any one time, 3,000 here, 2,000 there, sometimes 5. Amounts that wouldn't trigger immediate alarm bells, but that, added up, totaled just under $60,000. George looked at me with an expression I won't forget. He said, "Leonard, I've been meaning to ask about these." I said, "I'd like to know where that account is held." He didn't know. She had done it through a different institution. I drove home and sat in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes. $60,000. 4 years. An envelope. A letter. A man with silver hair who had listened to my heart for 11 years and then decided he wanted my wife. I thought about my boys. I thought about how I was going to tell Patrick and Neil that their mother had been living a separate life inside our life. I thought about what this would do to them, and then I stopped thinking about them because I couldn't afford to fall apart. Not yet. I called an attorney that afternoon, a woman in Knoxville who specialized in family law and who had been recommended to me by my buddy Clarence. We'd built houses together for 15 years before I retired. Her name was Judith Hale, and she was brisk and clear-eyed, and she asked me questions for an hour and took notes on a yellow legal pad without reacting to a single thing I said, which is exactly the kind of attorney you want in a moment like that. "Don't move any money yet," she said. "Don't confront your wife yet. Don't give any indication that you know anything. What I need you to do first is document." I asked her what that meant exactly. "It means," she said, clicking her pen, "that we're going to be methodical. I am 64 years old. I built things my whole life. I know how to be patient, how to work slowly and carefully toward something that needs to be right the first time. Rushing a foundation, rushing a frame, that's how things collapse." I applied that same discipline to the next 6 weeks of my life. I installed a small recording device in my home office, legal in Tennessee under single-party consent. Judith confirmed this, and I began having casual conversations with my wife about our finances. Not confrontational, just questions. "Honey, I've been thinking about whether we should consolidate those accounts." She was careful. She didn't reveal anything directly, but she said enough that I was building a picture. I hired a private investigator, a former Knox County Sheriff's deputy named Dale, who charged $400 a day and did not waste words. Within 2 weeks, Dale had confirmed what I already knew from the letter. The relationship between my wife and Whitfield was ongoing. He had photographs, dates, times. He had documentation of 6 separate meetings over 5 weeks, including 2 at a condo in downtown Knoxville that, it turned out, was titled in Whitfield's name. That money she had moved. Judith traced it eventually, with help from a forensic accountant. 41,000 of the 60 had been deposited into a joint account that my wife had opened with Whitfield at a regional bank in Maryville. A joint account. They had been planning something together, not just an affair, a transition. When Judith told me that, sitting in her office on a Tuesday afternoon in November, I had to take a long breath before I could speak. "How do we proceed?" I asked. "We file," she said, "and we make sure everything is documented before she has a chance to move anything else." I called Patrick the night before we filed. I owed him that much, to hear it from me. He was quiet for a long time after I finished talking, and then he said, "Dad, how long have you known?" I told him about 7 weeks. He said, "You carried that for 7 weeks by yourself?" I said, "I needed to be sure I had everything in order before I talked to anyone. I didn't want to blow it." He was quiet again. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "That is my son. That is the man he became." And I felt something loosen in my chest when he said it. Neil was harder. Neil had always been closer to his mother, and when I called him the next morning, he didn't say much. He asked me to send him everything I had. He asked me to give him 24 hours. I said I would. He called me back 16 hours later, and his voice was different, flat and careful. And he said, "Dad, I found something you should know." Neil worked in corporate compliance in Portland. He knew his way around financial records in ways I didn't. What he found, digging through the same documents I'd shared with him, was this. The condo in Whitfield's name had been purchased 14 months ago. The down payment, $80,000, had been made through a wire transfer. The source of the wire was an LLC that Neil traced after 2 days of careful work to a business account my wife had set up 18 months ago, a business account in her name, using money she had moved from our household account in small increments over 3 years. She hadn't been saving $60,000. That had been the money I'd found. There was more. Judith's forensic accountant, once Neil handed over what he'd found, estimated the total closer to $140,000, moved over 4 years. $140,000. I had worked 31 years in construction. I had bad knees and a bad shoulder and a heart condition that had put me on a catheterization table, and my wife had spent 4 years moving $140,000 toward a life with another man. I want to be honest about what that felt like. It felt like grief. It wasn't anger first. I know people expect anger, and the anger came, but the first thing was grief. Plain and simple, the way you feel when something you build collapses and you're standing in the rubble trying to understand where the fault was. I let myself feel it for one night. I sat in my truck in the driveway of the house I'd built, and I let myself feel all of it. And then I went inside and I called Judith and I said, "Let's make sure we get everything." The divorce filing happened on a Thursday. Judith had everything ready. The financial records, Dale's documentation, the forensic accounting report, the recordings from my home office, and a deposition from George Petty, who was, it turned out, more than willing to testify about what he'd observed in our accounts. My wife was served at 9:15 in the morning at home while I was at Judith's office reviewing the final documents. Her attorney called Judith that same afternoon. I won't pretend the legal process was quick or clean. It took 11 months. There were depositions and counter-arguments and a mediation session that lasted 6 hours and ended without resolution. There were moments I was grateful for Judith's particular combination of thoroughness and absolute refusal to be rattled. There were moments I sat in waiting rooms and thought about the 31 years and wondered whether I had missed something, whether there had been signs I'd chosen not to see. I think there had been. I think I had filed them in that part of my brain I didn't like to visit, and I had chosen to believe in the marriage I thought I had rather than look too closely at the one I actually did. I don't say that to take blame for what she did. I say it because I'm 64 years old and I think there's no point in being dishonest about yourself, even when you're the one who was wronged. The settlement, when it came, was supervised by a judge who had reviewed all of the financial documentation. The $140,000 was factored into the division of assets. My wife's attorney argued that some of the transfers had been for household purposes. The forensic accountant's records were specific. The judge was not persuaded. Whitfield lost his position at the cardiology group 6 weeks after the filing. The medical board was not the focus of my case, but Dale's documentation, once it became part of the court record, was public. Someone at the cardiology group read it. That is not something I engineered. That is something that happened. I heard about it from Neil, who had been tracking things quietly from Portland. He called me on a Sunday morning in March and said, "Dad, Whitfield's out." He didn't say anything else, and neither did I for a moment. Then I said, "Okay." Neil said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah, I think I am." I have been living alone in a smaller house in the same neighborhood for 8 months now. I did not keep the house we built together. I thought about it and decided I didn't want to. Some things you don't rebuild. Some things you build from scratch. Patrick drove down from Charlotte the weekend I moved in. We put together furniture and ordered pizza and watched a baseball game. And he didn't bring up his mother, and neither did I. Neil called that night, and the three of us talked for an hour about nothing important. The way you do when what's important is just that everyone is still there. My knees still hurt in the mornings. My heart, according to my new cardiologist, I have a new cardiologist, is functioning well. The catheterization hadn't found any significant blockages. A little plaque, nothing that wasn't manageable with medication and a better diet. I walk every morning 4 miles and I've stopped needing to grab fence posts. I think about that recovery bay sometimes, the ceiling tiles, the heart monitor at 62 beats per minute, the way I lay there with tubes in my arm and heard 3 words that rearrange everything. Careful this long. I think about what it means to be careful, about the difference between being careful with someone you love and being careful not to get caught, about how those two things can look the same from the outside for a very long time. My buddy Clarence asked me recently whether I was bitter. We were having coffee at a diner on Chapman Highway on a Tuesday morning, the way we've done most Tuesdays for 15 years. He asked me carefully, the way Clarence asks things, giving me room to answer honestly. I thought about it. "No," I said. "I'm not bitter." He looked at me. "I'm clear," I said. "There's a difference." He nodded. He's known me long enough to understand what I mean. I drove home after that with the windows down. In October, the hills east of Knoxville, just starting to turn. I pulled into the driveway of my smaller house and sat there for a moment, with the engine off. I had built this house too, in a manner of speaking. Smaller than the last one. Quieter. But the foundation was solid. I'd made sure of that. I got out of the truck and went inside.